All right. Well, I apologize for keeping you a few minutes longer. I forgot the schedule and kept on going when I should have wrapped it up. So we will watch things a little bit more closely. This time, as we get close to the end of the allotted time, start fidgeting, all right? Start looking off in the distance, and I'm good at reading eyes. The title of this section in the program is Marriage and Family, the Consequences of Obergefell versus Hodges. And I've subtitled this just so I can remember the outline that I want to talk about. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in the baby carriage. How many people remember that? Raise your hand. How many of you are older than 25? I brought that up to a friend of mine on the radio, and he said, I've never heard that before. I need to grow more hair. Okay, a few words by way of introduction. So we're going to talk about Obergefell and its consequences. But the first thing that needs to be said is we need to talk about what Obergefell did and what it did not do. And maybe I should even start before that. So the court case titled Obergefell versus Hodges refers to a man from Michigan whose last name is Obergefell, who applied for a wedding license from the state of Michigan and was denied because the partner he wanted to marry was the same sex as himself. And this case worked its way up through the federal courts, through the circuit courts, and wound itself at the Supreme Court of the United States. While it was winding its way up there, in summer of 2013, another case came which where the Supreme Court in the case of Windsor, what I want to say, they declared unconstitutional the Defense of Marriage Act, and that was written by Justice Kennedy. And then in December of 2016, the very same Justice Kennedy wrote an opinion which declared that that Obergefell should not have been denied the marriage license simply because of his being the same sex as the one he wanted to marry. That's Obergefell. I've been talking about it a little bit carefully here because I want to say from the outset, we got to be clear what Obergefell did and what it did not do. First of all, Obergefell did not make any laws. For those constitutional scholars here, and really anybody that can read, no court can make laws. That is the job of the legislative branch. Only legislation can do that. What the court did was to declare laws, specifically the law of Michigan regarding marriage licenses. It declared that law to be unconstitutional. So it declared one law of one state to be unconstitutional. And in other words, in the state of Michigan, it erased the legal distinction concerning male-female complementarity. That's a kind of touchstone to last presentation. And he did this only when male-female complementarity was touching on the issue of the state's issuance of a marriage license. That's what Obergefell did. But as you all know, the way that rulings from the Supreme Court work, practically, it's like a leaven in the legal system. So it wasn't just Obergefell's marriage license that it was concerned with, but every single state in the Union. So in all practicality, it cast out, or it called unconstitutional any state law that, that issues marriage licenses on the basis of male-female complementarity. I'm going to talk about this word a little bit later, but so when you're drawing lines about marriage, who should get married and who shouldn't, everybody draws lines. I don't care how radical the person is, what the agenda is, everybody's drawing lines about who should and who shouldn't get married. To my knowledge, we don't have anybody yet who's advocating that we obliterate the line that doesn't allow one-year-olds to get married. Could come. We have virtually every other line concerning marriage that is being challenged in one way or the other. But so the question here is that if we're talking about male-female complementarity being thrown out with regard to the issuance of marriage licenses, does male-female complementarity also get thrown out with regard to every other issue of marriage? That's a question which is still up in the air. Some people are assuming that that's what Obergefell meant. Other people are assuming that that has to be decided by legislative branches, and other people are hoping for another Supreme Court decision to decide that one too. It's all over the map. So the question that's on the table is, what about complementarity? The legal male-female distinction. Once you have that question on the table about whether it is legally relevant to make a distinction between males and females, that opens up Pandora's box to bathrooms, education, housing. What happens when you send your kids off to college and find out that your daughter is assigned a male roommate? Medicine. We just saw this hoopla recently about they were going to give free, I forget what it was exactly, I think they were cervical exams to men who identified as women. How do you do that medically? Crazy. Birth certificate and so forth. So the question being, does male or female have any relevance at all in any area whatsoever? You can see just how broad of a question that is. And if it does have relevance, then what or when is it relevant? Under what circumstances is it relevant? And then finally, on what basis is it relevant? That's the legal struggle today. So the point is that Obergefell had very narrow, limited consequences. Strictly speaking, it was about this one guy, whether or not he should get a marriage license. But practically speaking, it has enormous consequences. Now, if we take that legal struggle that I just articulated and put it theologically, the question is, does Obergefell only guarantee the right to marry, or does it also establish the entire religion behind the right to marry? This is just kind of an aside thing. We really need to understand that we are not, I said this in the previous, and I'm going to say it again ad nauseum. We are not dealing just with matters of morality. We are dealing with the establishment of a new state religion. We can name it. We were taught it in seminary what it's called. It's called Gnosticism. And it is rapidly becoming the established state religion, and that's what this is about. So the question is, does Obergefell only guarantee a narrow right to marry? By the way, I always put quotes around the word marriage because same-sex marriage is an Unding. It simply isn't. By the way, I wrote for my local paper for about a year and a half, and my editor thought it was great because he didn't have to write as much. Every Wednesday or every Friday, he'd get a 1,400-word column, and things were going just great guns. And about a month and a half ago, it was beginning of December, I wrote a column about some same-sex marriage matters, and I put quotations around the word marriage, same-sex, quote, marriage. And I just sent the column to him with a little note attached saying, I know this is probably not editorial design, but would you please leave the quotation marks where they are? He did. But he came unglued. He wrote a screed in the next paper that had me, I was the devil himself, for quotation marks. Okay. Anyway, I think quotation marks now are a matter of confession. Anyway, so what about the whole freight that comes behind the right for same-sex marriage? What I'd like to do to begin here is to let an internationally known spokeswoman for the LGBT lobby answer that question. How many of you are familiar with the name Masha Gessen? Masha Gessen. We got one. Okay. Masha Gessen said in 2012, you can look this up and listen to her quote on the internet. Quote, "Fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we are going to do with marriage when we get there. Because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change, and that is a lie. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change. And again, I don't think it should exist." Close quote. You wonder where we're going. Well, that's where we're going. So that sets us up for the first part of the outline about, and that is first comes love. So, and again, let me emphasize, our situation today is not caused by the Obergefell monstrosity. Our situation today is caused by factors that have been at work for many years. In matter of fact, I'll go so far as to say that Obergefell is not the end result of the process. It's not the game. It's a stage stop on the way. There's still a lot more to come. I don't know how many of you noticed, but the week after Obergefell said that same-sex marriage is now a thing, we started having the transgender movement. That is that there is no such thing as male or female at all. That's all it took. So, but I digress because this is important to say, very important. Please hear me. The first thing to say about the sexual revolution is that it was not begun by homosexuals. Understand this. It's not even begun by LGBT activists, and I make a huge distinction between homosexuals, transgenders who are really struggling with deep heart hurt and issues on the one hand, and LGBT activists who, in my experience, I don't know if this is across the board, but in my experience, LGBT activists aren't homosexual. They're simply political activists trying to use the homosexuals for their purposes. But at any rate, there's a huge distinction, and we need to treat them differently. But I'm talking about LGBT activists. Even the sexual revolution was not started by them. Even they are only the most recent tools of Satan, and they will be discarded when their usefulness is fully exploited. The people who started the sexual revolution were heterosexuals. Always keep that in mind. So that the foundations of Obergefell were laid by the sexual revolution during the 60s. But even that doesn't go far enough back, as my friend in the back was telling me at the break, right? The sexual revolution of the 60s was breaking out of the Gnostic heresy. It was a breaking out of Gnosticism into Western culture, and particularly mediated the Gnosticism which kind of came through the Romantic movement. The philosophy of Romanticism is what we're seeing. Now I want to back up 2,000 years and go low and fast. Please don't question me on this because I can't defend it, but no, I'm just kidding. I've got enough to defend it, but I want to just brush over it lightly, okay? And that is that generally speaking, Christianity at the beginning right after Pentecost, found a pagan Roman culture that didn't know love, at least when it was related to marriage. They had divorced love from marriage in such a way that marriage was for producing legitimate progeny for Roman citizens. And the quota was 5. A Roman woman was supposed to bear 5 Roman citizens in order to keep the population where it ought to be. Love was pursued with slave girls and boys. That's the ugly reality that the Christians found themselves in the first century. But Christianity came into this context and saw her bridegroom give himself to the bride in sheer unadulterated love. And so Christianity was the leading force in bringing love back into the marriage context. But from the start, or from that very beginning, there's always been this Gnostic impulse to kind of swing the pendulum from marriage and no love to love without progeny at all. And that is ancient Gnosticism in a nutshell. So here, instead of having a progeny-dominated view of marriage, Gnosticism tended to isolate love and exclude generation. So, to address the fullness of what Satan has been doing to our minds and hearts and our culture, we need to think first about love. And I just lay that down as a marker. We don't have time to do that tonight, and that's not on the outline, but I needed to lay that down. First comes love. Too much needs to be said on this subject here. I'll just give you this excellent place to begin. If you have not yet read the little book by C.S. Lewis titled The Four Loves, take it up. It's profound. It is profound. The Four Loves. In it, he deals with storge, which is familial love, philios, where we get Philadelphia, friendship kind of love, eros, which is the marital kind of love, and finally, agape, which is the divine love, which in Lewis's accounting of things kind of embraces and lifts them all up. There's much to be said here. I think I'm going to have to skip it for now. But by collapsing these wildly different realities, these wildly different kinds of love into one thing, with the bumper sticker, love equals love, we do a grave injustice to human beings. One of the things that just grieves me tremendously when I look at the young generation, I see it in my kids, and it just kills me. And that is by sexualizing, by bringing eros into everything, we haven't enriched anything, but we have robbed the next generation of loves, which the older generation, those of us who are 40, 50 years old, we knew without a question. I mean, my tightest, closest friends were a band of a half a dozen males, and we did everything together. And it was a formative time. My kids, my boys, don't have any male friends. If you get too close to a male friend in this culture, the assumption is sexual. And it's robbed many, and women. You talk about the loneliness of our culture. It's oftentimes attributed to things like this. Anyway, like I say, I'm just kind of laying down a marker here, huge things to talk about. But it's one reason that the rhetoric of love equals love has swept America, is that we didn't have the Greek language. We only have one word for these four concepts. And so it lends credence to what's technically known as a logical fallacy of equivocation. I mean, who can say with a straight face that familial love equals marital love? The love of dawdling a grandchild on the knee equals marital love. That's nuts. And nobody would say that if we had the language. But because we don't have that language and we can say love equals love, and everybody goes, oh yeah, okay, I'll put an equal sign on the back of my Prius. Sorry. Just kidding. All right, first comes love, then comes marriage. Everybody wants equality. I mentioned this before. We all want married love to be applied evenly to every citizen. We do. But the question is, what is marriage? What is this thing to which we all have equal access? And again, how do you draw the lines? Everybody's drawing lines. We draw lines by age. We draw lines by number. One of the most curious things of the Obergefell decision is that throughout the whole decision, Anthony Kennedy, keeps on saying that it's the right of any two people to get married. It's the right of any two people to get married. And he never answers the question, why two? Why two? If you don't have male and female anymore, why two and not three? Or one? Who knows? So, age, number, family relations, and so forth. The question is, what's the reason for the lines, and where are they to be drawn? So I want to kind of draw out for you, and I'll do this by kind of bouncing back and forth so you can see visually. Marriage as it was defined for 5,000 years, 6,000 years, I'll use Ussher's chronology. 6,000 years of humans' existence defined in one way to marriage redefined. Marriage redefined according to Obergefell is about an intense emotional experience. That's what marriage is about. There is a gay philosopher at Wayne State University in Nebraska who's kind of on the leading edge of articulating this, and the way he put it is, marriage is about your number one person. It's about your number one person, which of course implies there's a number two person and a number three person, which means that marriage, according to this new accounting, is about intensity, which is on a sliding scale of degree, right? You get more and more and more intense until somewhere along the line you kind of morph into the intensity of marriage kind of love. But it's always on a sliding scale, and who knows what part of the scale you're on. We didn't have that problem when we had marriage defined biblically, because biblically defined, it's not a matter of degree, but it is a matter of kind. That's why I started off by talking about the 4 kinds of love. There's one kind of married love, and then there's a kind of familial love, and there's a kind of friendship love, and so forth. So that brings me to talk about then, so if it's a different kind and not just a difference of degree, then what is the kind of love that's marriage, and what's the kind that's not? And the kind of love, well, it's the kind of union that is marriage, we call a comprehensive union. Comprehensive. And the kind of union that is redefined marriage is an intense emotional union. So now we got to go and we've got to define some terms here. What's comprehensive union? Well, comprehensive union means a union of your whole person. Your whole person. That's comprehensive union. Oh, bing! We're Lutherans. We've got this language already. In Christology, it's called the personal union. Right? So we can think about Christ and learn something about comprehensive union. What's a personal union? The personal union is the union of 2 natures, human and divine. Right? The whole of Chalcedonian Christology is built on talking about this comprehensive union of human and divine. Now that's analogous to the wedding union. It's also analogous, by the way, to the union of body and soul. How does the Athanasian Creed put it? You can look at it on page 319 in your hymnal. I think it's 320 actually, because it says it in the third section of the Athanasian Creed. As the rational soul and flesh is one man, so God and man is one Christ. So the union of man, of God and man, making one Christ, personal union, is an analogy to the union in you of your rational soul and your flesh. That's who you are. Your person is an enfleshed soul or an ensouled body. You can say it either way, but soul and body go together to make your person, and you can never sunder one from the other and treat the soul all by itself as though you're simply an angel trapped in a body for 70 or 80 years to be freed at death. Nor can you go in the other way and say that I'm simply a body. I'm simply an animal, and my soul is not a cohesive part of that nature. To talk about your person is to talk about the rational soul and human flesh together. So you are an embodied soul. Your body is integral to who you are. Sorry about that. The question is then, how does one have union, or how does one have union of a body? Well, let's talk about the union of a body. What makes something unified is that it all works together, right, to form one integrated whole, right? So you have a cardiopulmonary system. Each one of you sitting there individually has a cardiopulmonary system, and you're breathing in and you're breathing out, and it's being pumped to the various extremities and so forth. And nobody else's breathing in and breathing out helps you. Only yours does, right? And your breathing in, your heartbeat does not help the guy sitting next to you or the girl sitting next to you, right? It's yours, and it's integral to your body. That's the unity of a system. Okay, so you get the idea here? You also have a unified digestive system where your digestion helps you and you alone and not the person next to you. Get it? So how many of you have raise your hand if you've got a reproductive system. I know it's kind of an embarrassing question, but anyway, raise your hand if you have a reproductive system. Put your hand down. You don't. Nobody in this room has a reproductive system. Everybody in this room has half of one. Everybody in this room is infertile alone. That's what scriptures are talking about, where a man should leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's the one flesh union. Unlike a union of mind or a union of spirit or a union of wills, the union of body is such that when the union of body takes place, it could be that 9 months later it will require a name. That's complementarity in a nutshell. So, it's not good for a man to be alone. I will make a helpmeet for him, Genesis 2. But the help with what? Dishes? Yeah. Sermon preparation? No, you get the idea. So the one flesh union then is a reality that because the one flesh union is comprehensive, it also then requires comprehensive commitments. Because when one flesh union happens, where and when God wills, and a new life comes into the world, that new life is not temporary but eternal. Eternal. Like C.S. Lewis said, you've never met an ordinary human being. Everybody you've ever met is going to live eternally. There's a mission thought for you. Anyway, so you've got this, this necessitates then comprehensive commitments. And this goes back to explaining why I was talking earlier about the marriage vows, which already are indicated in capsule form in Genesis chapter 2. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. It indicates this exclusive, permanent, and complementary relationship. And then it works itself out in the marriage vows, which are found in the hymnal. What are they, page 276 or something? You can check me on this. But for instance, the exclusive marriage vow then comes out in the hymnal with the words, I pledge you my faithfulness. Nobody else. Now, why is that necessary? Well, because once a child is conceived, that child is determined by God to have his mother and father living under the same roof, loving each other for the rest of his life. That's a commitment that we make to that child. And if I have two children from two different women, I can only give either one of them 50% of my time and love and energy. But I don't care if I have 14 children from the same woman. They can all get all of my love and attention and energy. So faithfulness. The second of the marriage vows is permanence, right? And we express this by saying, till death us do part. Or again, as long as you both shall live. And then finally, the one flesh union is described by complementarity, where the words here are operative: wife and husband. You have different vows. And man and woman. So let me go back to, as I was kind of laying out, you've got marriage defined scripturally, what we just talked about, and marriage defined, redefined. Here's a question to ask your friends when you get into a discussion about this. Ask them sincerely and let them just think and answer you. Don't treat it as a rhetorical question. Can the redefinition of marriage account for the marriage vows? You know, ask your friend who thinks Obergefell is a good thing. Ask them, if Obergefell is a good thing, then tell me why we should ever say, till death do us part. What's the purpose of that? I guarantee you, you'll get a lot of this. Yeah. Ask them why faithfulness. And again, complementarity has already been overtly thrown out. There's another question to ask when you come to the divine, or the reinvention, the redefinition of marriage, and that is, can the redefinition of marriage account for the government's involvement in marriage? Why do you want the government involved in an intense emotional relationship? What are they supposed to do about that? Does the government have an interest in an intense emotional relationship? Does the government have an interest in encouraging fathers and mothers to stay together under the same roof and raise the children they've begotten? You can see it immediately, right? There's very crisp questions to be asked about this. And so, as we talked about already, Obergefell then attacks complementarity overtly, but it diminishes all three aspects of the marriage vows. It diminishes the exclusive, it diminishes the permanent, and it diminishes the complementarity. It diminishes the complementarity, as we've already said, so I won't dwell on this, by means of same-sex marriage, and transgenderism. Right, you can see the obliterating of lines. It diminishes the exclusivity in a number of different ways. How many of you have heard of the idea of a throuple? A couple of you. The throuple were first showed up in print in the Atlantic, which is a pretty mainstream East Coast magazine. It showed up in July of 2014, 3.5 years ago. Throuple, if you take the word couple and you chop off the C and you add a THR, you get throuple. And the idea is, it's a direct challenge to Justice Kennedy, who said that any two people have the right to get married. The immediate question was, why not three people? Why can't you have a throuple? And I've asked this question to my LGBT activist friends. Why not? Nobody has yet answered it. That's throuple. There's another way of undermining the exclusivity, and this too came out in a piece by Mark Oppenheimer in New York Magazine in 2011, June 30th, 2011. Title of the article is "Married with Infidelities." Married with Infidelities. And it was written by a gay activist named Dan Savage. And what he coined was, he was asked the question, so what is gay marriage going to teach your heterosexual friends? And his answer was, it's going to teach them the value of monogamish. What? Monogamish, with an SH. Instead of monogamous, which is exclusive, monogamish means kinda, and married with infidelities. He thought this was actually a virtue, not a vice. Yes. And then, of course, the third way of breaking down the exclusive part is through, we've got a, what's it called, sister wives. I don't get TV, so somebody tell me what that is. Is it a, what? A man with four wives. And it's a kind of a reality show kind of deal? Okay. Now, it's more than a reality show, because immediately after, was it immediately after? Let me check my dates here. No, it was immediately after the Defense of Marriage Act was struck down by the Windsor case in 2013, that this guy on the Sister Wives show, he sued for the right to polygamy. Why not? If any two people can get married, then exclusivity is not necessary either. By the way, helpful. I find in this whole area it's very helpful to stop and think about words. What does polygamy mean? Think about it, you Greek scholars. Break it down. Poly is many. What's gamy? Gamy is a marriage. So polygamy is literally many marriages. and even polygamy holds to the traditional view of marriage. It's just as you got four of them in this case instead of one. You've got this marriage between this sister and this guy, and you've got this marriage between the second sister and this guy. So you've got four marriages going on. That's different from polyamory, which is another new thing coming up. Polyamory means many loves. But polyamory, there's only one marriage, but it's a group marriage. The idea is, instead of having only two people on each of four marriage certificates, you've got a marriage certificate that has 5 people on it, and they're all married to each other. I know it's unbecoming to speak these things in the house of God. I mean that, and I'm sorry. But we have to articulate them to be able to defend ourselves, to defend Christ's gospel. Anyway, those are some examples of how Obergefell is attacking marriage. exclusivity. And finally, Obergefell attacks marriage's permanence by what already was coming before: divorce, the shack-up, the hookup culture, and then the new thing that happened after Obergefell is something that's called wed lease. You heard of this one yet? Wed lease is a play on the word wedlock. Holy wedlock is one man, one woman, one lifetime. Wed lease is one man, one woman will sign a 5-year lease. And we'll revisit it after 5 years to see whether we want to keep going or not. In matter of fact, while this has been floated in America, it was actually in Mexico City back in 2011 that it was proposed as a law. I don't think it's passed yet, but these are the kinds of things, the kinds of ways, and the point is, first comes love, then comes marriage. What Obergefell is doing is not just about same-sex marriage. It is about a whole new definition of marriage which undermines and loosens all marriage bonds because it treats them in a different way. And most importantly, what it does is it takes the legitimate interests of government to uphold marriage bonds, and it makes government abdicate their responsibility. So that's the point of the second part of the outline. Am I supposed to quit already? Looks like it.
You got 5 minutes or so, 5 minutes, whatever.
Okay, I will take 5-10 minutes. 5 minutes. Then comes baby in the baby carriage. Fundamentally, how are children related to marriage? Is marriage for children? That is to say, do we have marriages because it benefits the children, or do we have children to benefit the marriage? Obergefell begins in Kennedy's reasoning by denying that marriage has anything whatsoever to do with children. That's how he can get away with denying complementarity. Kennedy and the progressive justices are totally unmoved by the legal briefs which detailed what we just talked about. They insist that marriage is only about love between two people. And they repeatedly and consistently talked about those two people, but don't give reason for why it's not three. But no sooner did they prevail. Here's the great irony of Obergefell. No sooner did they prevail that children became central to the struggle. Progressives do observe that historically children have always been part of adulthood and of marriage. And they argue that the intrinsic absence of children from marriage would delegitimize it. So embedded in Kennedy's opinion is the idea that marriage bestows dignity. In oral arguments, the Attorney General of Michigan, Bursch, Kennedy exploded when he tried to defend Michigan's marriage laws. He says, "I don't understand that marriage is not dignity bestowing. I thought the whole purpose of marriage was to bestow dignity on both man and woman in traditional marriage. Marriage is dignity bestowing." This is Kennedy. And these parties say they want that same ennoblement. You should read I think it was Scalia's response to this idea that government can bestow dignity. But at any rate, that's the idea behind Obergefell. But then this logically leads to this. For the state to bestow full dignity, the state must now use its power to give same-sex couples access to children. They must use their power to give same-sex couples access to children, and this is done in two primary ways. One of them is by adoption law. That's why as soon as Massachusetts became the sixth jurisdiction in the world to legalize same-sex marriage, the Catholic Charities Adoption Agency had to cease operating in Massachusetts because they had the mandate that they had to adopt children to same-sex couples. They couldn't do it. And the same thing happened to our own Lutheran Child and Family Services in Illinois. When Illinois adopted same-sex marriage, that was in 2011, I believe it was. Both Catholic Charities and LCFS had to close up shop in Illinois because same-sex marriage brings along with it the necessity for government to mandate adopting children to same-sex couples, which no Christian in good conscience can do. And thanks be to God, we had faithful leaders of LCEF who understood that and stood firm. The second thing that happened with Obergefell is something called a conception mandate, and this is enforced in California, the land of the fruits and nuts, but it's to be taken seriously. I'll tell you, it's already in Wyoming. But the conception mandate is this. This is what they say in California, that any couple that cannot conceive children after trying for a year is then determined by the state to be infertile and can receive free fertility treatments. And it doesn't matter whether that couple is same sex or not. Now, you do the math. It's sheer madness, but it is the conception mandate. And along with the conception mandate, this brings in something called surrogacy laws. Gosh, I can't go on that. Ask me in the Q&A tomorrow. Let me just bring up one last thing. Birth certificates. To give children access, or excuse me, to give same-sex couples access to marriage, what we're finding in Wyoming, and probably in your state if you pay attention to what's going on at the legislature, they're not content with just saying that same-sex couples should have the ability to adopt children. They are now saying that same-sex couples should have the ability to have their names on the birth certificate, so the child never knows that it was adopted. Of course, when he gets to be 13 years old and sees two females on the birth certificate, he might figure something out. But that's what's going on. There was a court case in a neighboring state in Arkansas last summer, Pavon versus Smith, where they sued and got the right to put two females on the birth certificate just because they happened to be married when the child was born. And that's what they're trying to do in Wyoming. They've already done that in California and other states. Okay, last thing. I started off with Masha Gessen. I'm going to go back to Masha Gessen. I'm going to read that quote again, but she doesn't stop where I stopped. She goes on. Listen to her. Fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we are going to do with marriage when we get there. Because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change, and that is a lie. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change. And again, I don't think it should exist. I don't like taking part in fictions about my life. That's sort of not what I had in mind when I came out 30 years ago. I have 3 kids who have 5 parents, more or less. And I don't see why they shouldn't have 5 parents legally. I met my new partner, and she had just had a baby, and that baby's father is my biological brother. And my daughter's biological father is a man who lives in Russia, and my adopted son also considers him his father. So the 5 parents break down into 2 groups of 3. And really, I'd like to live in a legal system that's capable of reflecting that reality. And I don't think that's compatible with the institution of marriage. You want to know what the end game is? It's about children. Finally. It's about children. Ask yourself, who loses the most in this situation? It's the children. Right. So, 3 things. Find your voice. It's about the children of future generations. It's not about you. It's not about lesbians or gays. It's about the children. Let's speak up for them the same way we do in the pro-life movement. Number 2, now that we can see the end game, it gives us clarity. And it gives us an opportunity as a church to rethink the deep theology of marriage and children. And that means rethinking the unintended consequences of IVF, surrogacy, fornication, shack-ups, you name it. All of these are coming into focus to give vigor to our renewed study. And thirdly, now that we can see clearly the physical, emotional, and spiritual harm that comes to both children of same-sex as well as participants of same-sex marriage, we can see these matters as mercy for our neighbors, mercy for those who are robbed and lying in a ditch, and we have no choice but to reach out a helping hand. And this, of course, necessarily involves us in the public square in the same way that our reaching out to the unborn brings us to the public square. Thanks for your extra attention.